In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear friends, welcome to the Theological Youth Group broadcast. We are currently continuing our reading of the sayings of the Desert Fathers. Let us pray, and we will proceed. O heavenly King, comforter the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us, and cleanse us of all impurity, and save our souls, O good one. Last week we finished the reading of Saint John the Dwarf and read Saint Isidore the priest. Today we're going to read Saint Isidore of Pelusia and others as well. Isidore of Pelusia, Chapter 1. Abba Isidore of Pelusia said, "To live without speaking is better than to speak without living. For the former, who lives rightly, does good even by his silence, but the latter does no good even when he speaks. When words and life correspond to one another, they are together the whole of philosophy." Now, this is beautiful and very important in the sense that sometimes it's not the extremes. We don't really see people living completely without speaking or speaking completely without living. All of us are somewhere in between. And sadly enough, most likely we speak too much, and we live not enough. That is to say, we speak about God's law, we speak about the Christian life, but we don't do it, we don't practice it enough. And so it would actually be better for us to live more and to speak less. But here, he gives sort of the polar opposites. Living without speaking, that is to say that somebody lives a Christian life but does not advertise it in any way, doesn't speak of his Christian life, and then somebody who speaks but doesn't live it at all. Well, as I said, we're somewhere in between. Ideally, though, for our life and for our words to correspond, he basically says that would be the whole of philosophy. And of course, when the fathers speak of philosophy, they're not talking about the ancient Greek philosophy. They're talking of the love of wisdom. That's sort of the more literal understanding there. Chapter 2, the same Abba said, "Prize the virtues and do not be the slave of glory, for the former are immortal, while the latter soon fades." So basically what he's saying is value the virtues more than glory, because glory is here today, it's gone tomorrow. You could be famous today, tomorrow you could be infamous. But if you have the virtues today, most likely they will remain with you until the end of your life, unless you sort of actively seek to undermine them. Chapter 3, he also said, "Many desire virtue, but fear to go forward in the way that leads to it, while others consider that virtue does not even exist. So it is necessary to persuade the former to give up their sloth and teach the others what virtue really is." So this is very interesting. Many desire virtue, but fear to go forward in a way that leads to it, while others consider that virtue does not even exist. Well, quite literally, I think for many people, the consideration of having to live a virtuous life is a challenge. And some people think, well, we read about the lives of the saints and we read about their great feats. Well, we can't do that. That's not for us. And so some are too timid to try it, while others might say, virtue does not exist. Virtue to that extent, virtue at that level. So then, of course, it is the job of the clergy first and foremost. It's the clergy's responsibility. And for any conscientious Christian, whenever you are aware that your fellow brother or sister is not sort of embarking on a path of the acquisition of virtue due to the fear, of trials on that path, or perhaps maybe because the person thinks it's just outright impossible, it's best then, based on what we read in the first chapter, to have the actual life of virtue, so that even without speaking much, you can encourage by your example and you can inspire by your example. So in that sense, every Christian is able to lead others, is able to inspire others, but you have to do it not with words, because if all you do is just speak about it but you don't live it, well, obviously your lack of depth will be seen very quickly, will be perceived very quickly, and then your best intention will lead perhaps not to such a good outcome, Chapter 4. He also said, "Vice takes men away from God and separates them from one another. So we must turn from it quickly and pursue virtue, which leads to God and unites us with another." Now the definition of virtue and of philosophy is simplicity with prudence. So this is quite interesting. So vice, or sinful life, takes men away from God and separates them from one another. Reasonably so, because if you're not even sinning against other people directly so as to create an argument, if you are sinning secretly, your conscience will condemn you. And a condemning conscience is a great vulnerability. It's a spiritual vulnerability which makes you sort of incapable of having a wholesome view of the people around you. When you are living a life of sin and your conscience is constantly accusing you, you perceive other people maybe having, sort of malicious intent toward you, or ill intent, if not toward you, then in other sort of ways. And perceiving this, obviously, you get separated from other people because you don't have the best perception of what they do and why they do it. Because sin blinds you. It actually sort of prevents you from seeing things the way they truly are. Whereas a proper life, a life of virtue, leads you to God and helps you to be more compassionate and understanding of other people, so that even their shortcomings do not bar you from at least being at peace with them, at peace with them being near you, and so on. So that's very important. And of course, the definition of virtue and philosophy is simplicity with prudence. Well, simplicity here is not meant as something simple, as if something crude. Simplicity here is actually meant in the same way that God is simple. In other words, God is simple because he's not complex. He is not sort of a multifaceted. Simply, God is love and goodness. There's no if, but, whatever, or and. And simplicity with prudence. Prudence, of course, most likely in this case, it's a synonym of discernment. And so the fathers actually, and the other fathers, say that virtue without discernment, or in this case virtue, sort of the practice of virtue without prudence, is also a sin. In other words, if you fast too much or not enough, it's not good. You're not going to accomplish your goal of acquiring virtue. If you pray too much or too little, once again, you're missing the mark. And even think of it this way. The meaning of the Greek word sin, amartia, it literally means missing the mark. You're not hitting the target. You're straying away from it. You're not coming to the center of it. And so, in that sense, discernment is most necessary. But in order to have discernment, you must have simplicity, because if you simplicity as in purity and wholesomeness, that's what it means in this particular case. Chapter 5. He also said, the heights of humility are great, and so are the depths of boasting. I advise you to attend to the first and not to fall into the second. Well, that's quite simple. I think that it really doesn't even sort of require commentary, because I think recently we read, maybe even in this same book, about a monk who decided to go and see his friend at night so as not to be seen, but the angels lit his way and all the people came and glorified him. And so the word of the scripture is fulfilled. God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And so Father Isidore here is just saying that in a slightly different way. Chapter 6. He also said, the desire for possessions is dangerous and terrible, knowing no satiety. It drives the soul which it controls to the heights of evil. Therefore let us drive it away vigorously from the beginning, for once it has become master, it cannot be overcome. Well, that's quite true, because avarice has that insatiable quality to it. If you allow it to take root in your heart, it doesn't matter how much you acquire and obtain, it's always not enough. It's always not enough. You want more and more and more and more. And it can truly drive you to great heights of evil, because in some cases people cross the line between honest earnings and stealing. They cross the line between sort of having your own and taking someone else's. And of course that is very detrimental spiritually, and even sort of, in this material world. If you cross that line and you steal and you cheat and you lie, if you get caught, you can actually have even worldly consequences, such as an arrest, an imprisonment, conviction and imprisonment, and in some cases also the confiscation of the goods and means that you have stolen from other people. The next is Isaac, priest of the cells. Isaac of the cells was an anchorite in Nitria. He was a disciple of Abba, whom he succeeded as priest and superior in Nitria in 395. He was exiled by Archbishop Theophilus as an Origenist with the four tall brothers. Saying 5 introduces the theme of homosexual temptations, which is noticeably absent from the first generation in Setis. It appears as part of the decline in monastic standards after the devastations. The devastations, that would be the incursions of the pagans. There is in these sayings a nostalgia for the virtues and austerities of the early days, which mark them as belonging to the third generation. Chapter 1. One day they came to make Abba Isaac a priest. Hearing this, he ran away to Egypt. He went to a field and hid himself in the midst of the hay. So the clergy went after him in pursuit. Reaching the same field, they stopped there to rest a little, for it was night. They unharnessed their donkey and let it graze. The donkey went close to the old man. So when dawn came and they looked for the donkey, they found Abba Isaac too, which filled them with astonishment. They wanted to bind him, but he did not allow it, saying, I will not run away again, for it is the will of God, and wherever I flee, I find that. So we see here that he exhibited true humility, and when they wanted to make him a priest, he decided to avoid such great honor and responsibility of serving the church in the rank of the priest, and that's why he ran away to Egypt. But interestingly enough, those who looked for him had an animal which ended up finding him, and once he was found by the animal, and consequently by the owners of the animal, he accepted the will of God and did not resist ordination. Chapter 2. Abba Isaac said, when I was younger, I lived with Abba. He would never tell me to do any work, although he was old and tremulous, But he himself got up and offered food to me and to everyone. Then I lived with Abba Theodore of Fermi, and he did not tell me to do anything either, but he himself set the table and said to me, Brother, if you want to, come and eat. I replied, I have come to you to help you. Why do you never tell me to do anything? But the old man gave me no reply whatever. So I went to tell the old men. They came and said to him, Abba, the brother has come to your holiness in order to help you. Why do you never tell him to do anything? The old man said to them, Am I a Cenobite that I should give him orders? Cenobite, that means someone who lives in a sort of a commonwealth or a commune-like monastery. The Cenobitic monasticism is a monastery where the brothers live together and they share everything in common. These were the anchorites. They lived by themselves, so that's what he's saying. As far as I'm concerned, that's the Abba responding. I do not tell him anything, but if he wishes, he can do what he sees me doing. From that moment, I took the initiative and did what the old man was about to do. As for him, what he did in silence, so he taught me to work in silence. So we see here this is a very beautiful thing because they were anchorites, and the anchorites would only have a disciple or two, and they sort of lived by themselves. Rather than telling his disciple what to do, he actually showed him silently by his example. And it took the disciple going to sort of get other elders to come and help settle this point. But the point did get settled, and he understood what was expected of him and started following the example. Abba Isaac and Abba Abraham lived together. When he came home one day, Abba Abraham found Abba Isaac in tears. He asked him, Why are you weeping? The old man replied, Why should we not weep? For where have we to go? Our fathers are dead. Manual work is not enough to pay for the cost of the journey by boat for us to go and visit the old men. And so henceforth we are orphans. That is why I am weeping. So I imagine when it says the old men, he means the elders, basically the more experienced monastics. So they couldn't travel probably down the Nile River or one of the rivers there in Egypt. Would be the ones, sort of the means of transportation by boat to see them, further into the desert. Once again, Abba Isaac exhibits great humility. So he says, since we're not able to go visit the elders, we are orphans. We are left as orphans, and he is weeping. Chapter 4. Abba Isaac said, I knew a brother who wanted to eat an ear of wheat while he was harvesting in the field. He said to the foreman of the field, Will you allow me to eat an ear of wheat? The latter was astonished at these words and said to him, Father, this field belongs to you. Why are you asking me this? See how conscientious the brother was. So basically, the monk was harvesting wheat, and if he had a foreman, they must have worked, as a group harvesting, and they would get paid for their work at harvest. Most likely, they would be paid in wheat, or maybe in money that they bought the wheat with. But then they milled their wheat, and they, used the flour to bake bread, and then they dried the bread to keep it until the next harvest. And the foreman said to him, well, this field is yours. You're working here. You're going to get paid from it. So if you eat an ear of wheat, no big deal. But this particular brother was so conscientious, he did not want to be considered stealing. So he didn't take anything without asking first. And that, too, is a great example of both humility and vigilance on the part of the brother, who did not want to take something that he considered not to be his as of yet, because he didn't finish his work. Chapter 5. He also said to the brethren, Do not bring young boys here. 4 churches in cities are deserted because of boys. Now, this is something that sort of surfaces, in other ways as well. When you read about the Desert Fathers, about the fact that some of the monasteries required the young monastics, the youngest that they would take someone to be a monk, would have to be a young man who could grow a beard, because that way, if a young man had a beard, He would look like a man, and a man that is shaved, and it might sound odd to people nowadays, but a man that is shaved sort of can at some point resemble a woman, resemble a woman's face. And that was the reason. So in a way, really, the introduction to Abba Isaac, to Isaac, the priest of the cells, is not entirely correct. It's not just the fact that there might have been something, happening that had to do with homosexuality. It would have been dealing with that because there were no women around, but the temptation would actually present itself because a young boy can look like a woman in the face. And so, we're not going down this path. I don't want to tempt anyone by saying anything that isn't written here. It's quite short, but he's saying 4 churches in Setis are deserted because of boys, which might mean that something like a great temptation happened at the monastery that was, or with the anchorites who served in that church, and because of that they had to move, they had to leave, and the churches are deserted. That really underscores the necessity for prudence and discernment on our part in terms of not placing ourselves in a situation where we might be tempted to sin. If you have an attractive coworker and you are married, for example, don't take the liberty of, being left alone with that coworker, or God forbid, go to lunch with that coworker. I remember many years ago, somebody said that, well, a particular man, made a statement, I'm not afraid to go with a colleague out to lunch. It's not going to deter me from being, faithful to my wife. That may be the intent. But if you do go on such a lunch, it's possible that you may be tempted and you may give in and you sin. However, if you don't go to such a lunch, you won't be tempted and you won't sin. And in that sense, very often, the best strategy, the best idea is to prevent a temptation even from taking place. So basically, if you're avaricious, if you're connected, if you have a temptation of gaining possessions, well, don't go to the store and sort of act on your shopaholic tendencies. If you have a problem with alcohol, make sure you don't have any at home, because if you do and you think, well, I'll only have a little, I'll be okay, if you snap, you'll drink everything and it will be a major problem. If you have an inclination to use illegal substances, don't spend time with people who have access to such things and might actually even encourage you to use those. Make sure that your friends are those who would help you with sobriety and piety rather than actually enable you to sin. So in this particular case, it's not really so much about the boys as much as it is about the fact that boys, just by virtue of them possibly looking like a young woman, provide grounds for temptation. If you remove these grounds for temptation, nothing evil, nothing bad will take place. However, if you allow the causes of possible temptation to be present, to flourish, well, you might end up sort of reaping the terrible consequences. And I think that is how really we need to read this particular short chapter. The next chapter is also very short, chapter 6. It was said of Abba Isaac that he ate the ashes from the incense offering with his bread. Well, I think in the book of Psalms, it might said that, well, I put ashes on my head. That was something that people did. at the time of great sorrow. They would rend their garments and would put ashes on their heads. And so if he ate, if he mixed ashes with his bread, that was probably the pious expression of his penitence, of his sorrow for his sins and for his shortcomings. Chapter 7. Abba Isaac said to the brethren, our fathers, and Abba Pambo wore old garments woven from palm fronds and mended all over. Now you are foppishly dressed. Go away from here, leave this place. When they prepared to go harvesting, he said to them, I am not giving you any more directions because you would not keep them. So this is interesting. So this is the nostalgia that the introduction to this portion of the book mentioned. He's saying that the older fathers, Abba Pambo, and others, wore old garments. They were sewn all over, meaning they were mended all over, and the newer monks, the younger monks, are wearing nice, and sort of look stylishly and so on. Not such a good thing. At any rate, he basically then goes on to say, go away from here. I will not give you any more directions because you would not keep them. Now, that's quite interesting. There is another story about the relationship of an elder with a disciple. A younger monk came to an older monk and said, would you please be my spiritual father? And the older monk accepted, said, yes, of course, you could be my disciple. Then he said something to the younger monk, instructed him to do something, and the younger monk disregarded his instruction. He repeated it one more time. A while later, the younger monk once again disregarded him. I can't remember for certain if he did it 3 times. It's possible that the actual 3rd time he might have said something. If the monks disregarded it, the younger monk ignored him, disobeyed him, and then the elder basically crossed him and said, Lord, I am no longer responsible for his soul. And that is very significant and important. When someone's asking our advice, we must be aware, we must realize if the person is sincerely seeking advice to, sort of follow whatever we say, or the person is only avoiding responsibility of having to make his own or her own decision. We should be careful sort of offering advices left and right and telling people what to do, because whenever we do that, we take the responsibility for their actions. If the younger monk follows his elder with obedience, it is the elder who is responsible for the younger monk. So if he directed him amiss, or if he gave him advice that wasn't very good, if the younger monk fulfilled it for the sake of obedience, he would not be the one judged for it. The elder would be. The elder would have to give sort of a reckoning with God for the instruction that he provided for the younger monk. But if the younger people do not follow the instructions, then this is what happens. Abba Isaac says, leave, I will not tell you anything else because you are not going to do it. So essentially, why should I waste my breath? Why should I take the responsibility for you when in fact you're doing whatever it is that you want? You are the one that should bear that responsibility then in that case. Chapter 8. One of the fathers related how, in the time of Abba Isaac, a brother came into the church of the cells one day wearing a little hood. The old man turned him out, saying, this place is for monks. You are a secular and you may not live here. So I guess maybe his hood was too small, not like the others. And so the man turned him out. He just told him to leave. Abba Isaac did not accept him because he wasn't wearing the proper monastic garb. Now, it's not necessarily that just based on his clothing he was turned away. That would seem a little harsh, especially nowadays. We shouldn't judge people by their clothing, by their outward appearance. Quite possibly, Abba Isaac perceived some inner state of this monk which manifested itself in the way that he was dressed. And while our clothing might not correspond to our inner state properly, because sometimes we're dressed, we might not have the best of taste, we might also not have the best of the finances to get the particular clothing that we want. We might be forced in some cases to wear whatever was available, or whatever we had that was clean at the time. It might not be entirely, sort of appropriate in a given situation. However, our outward manifestations, our clothing, our body language, it does say something about the inner state of the soul as well. And most likely that is exactly what Abba Isaac perceived, is the inner state of this monk. And so while it says here in plain English that he was turned out because he had a small hood, not like the other monks, but Abba Isaac must have found that to be indicative of something. Well, there's an unrelated question here. What material did God use to create man? Well, it says that God created man out of earth. And after the man sinned, after Adam sinned, God said, "For dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return." For earth thou art, and unto earth shalt thou return. And then, of course, the earth itself, God created out of nothing. So we have to keep that in mind. Chapter 9. Abba Isaac said, "I have never allowed a thought against my brother, who has grieved me, to enter my cell. I have seen to it that no brother should return to his cell with a thought against me." Well, this is quite beautiful, and it shows to what extent Abba Isaac valued the interior peace. Yesterday, for the Russian speakers, we were reading the explanation of the Divine Liturgy by St. Nicholas Kabasilas, and when we reached the point of the beginning of Great Litany and the fact that it said, "In peace, let us pray to the Lord," St. Nicholas, in his commentary, was talking about how important it is to pray to God in peace, in outward peace, in peace with men, and in peace with God, in inner peace as well. And so what he is saying is, I have never allowed a thought against my brother who has grieved me. So basically, it's not an ungrounded thought. He was offended. Something was done against him, but he never allowed it to enter his cell, which basically means from the place and the time of the offense, by the time he came back to his cell, he settled the matter in his head and in his heart, so that when he entered the cell, he forgave his brother and he was at peace. And he also made sure that no one else would enter his cell with a thought against him. So that is a great ascetic labor in and of itself, to live in such a way, to live in peace with all men. That is very, very, very beneficial and quite significant. Chapter 10. Abba Isaac had a serious illness which lasted for a long time. The brother made him a little broth out of flour into which he put some fruit. The old man did not want to taste it, so the brother tempted him, saying, "Take a little, father, because you are ill." But the old man said to him, "Truly, brother, I should like this illness to last for 30 years. Well, the reason why the monastics sometimes welcomed serious illness and said things that are very counterintuitive to us. We covet great health nowadays. We sort of try to lead a healthy lifestyle. We worry about our bodily health. In fact, the current pandemic is showing us to what extent people are driven by fear, of receiving harm to themselves, either from the virus itself or from the vaccine. A lot of people, sort of are really quite hysterical, if you would, sort of accept that. But the fathers considered the benefit of illness for themselves in some cases, and of course, I'm not saying that we should look, for example, to be sick with coronavirus. God forbid. I wish everyone good health, and I hope that everyone stays healthy and safe, especially considering the fact that coronavirus can kill you, after a while, a short while, and incapacitate you to the extent that you would probably not get the spiritual benefit, the kind that Abba Isaac received from a serious illness, which he wished was to be prolonged. Because when you're sick, when you are sick enough, you are incapable of committing certain sins. Even if you wanted to, you couldn't. You don't have the strength. So in that particular case, the father saw illness as a benefit. It would almost be like an extra protection from sin. This is how they would view it, most likely. And that is exactly why he didn't want to have sort of the remedy, the broth that he would see as a remedy to help him get over his illness. But he, in fact, said, I wish that it lasted for 30 years. Because, in fact, illness sometimes, even though it is a labor of itself, illness can give a bit of rest to an ascetic in his struggle against certain passions. Because, for example, well, anyway, I won't go into it too much. I don't want to belabor the point. It is not easy sometimes to grasp it that someone would actually want to be sick. But when you consider the fact that otherwise, being healthy, the person is having a very difficult time resisting a certain temptation, in that sense, illness could be seen as an actual salvation from sin for that individual. Let's say, a person who was, a habitual thief, if he was truly struggling with that passion and he was stricken by sickness, which made him stay in bed. Well, you can't steal anything while you're lying in bed. Not unless somebody comes close enough to your bed that you would, pull something out of his pocket or out of her pocket, which is preposterous, really. I mean, if you are bedridden, you're not going to be out and about stealing. Not unless you do it in some digital way, or over the computer. But sort of the actual material stealing, you would not engage in. And thus, a person who was struggling with that sin would actually welcome illness because it would give him a respite, would give him sort of a leg up, you might say. That's not to say that we should all go and ask God to get sick. Ideally, it's better to learn to struggle and to resist our temptation in good health so that we don't lose our reward. Because if we're in good health, the struggle is real, because we're able to sin. When we're sick, there's less of a reward because we're not even able to sin. So there's no struggle. If there's no struggle, then there's no benefit. But sometimes struggle can be, sort of alleviated, at least for a while, by physical illness. Chapter 11. Concerning Abba Isaac, it was said that when he was at the point of death, the elders gathered round him, saying, What shall we do without you? He said to them, See how I have walked before you. If you want to follow me, keep the commandments of God. God will send you his grace and will protect this place. But if you do not keep his commandments, you cannot remain in this place. We ourselves, when our fathers were on the point of dying, were full of grief. But keeping the Lord's commandments and their admonitions, we have held fast as though they were still with us. Do the same in your turn, and you will be saved. Well, not much necessity to comment on this particular instruction. Basically, the people seeing him depart are seeing, maybe a generation depart in his sort of person. Some of us might have experienced things somewhat similar, remotely similar to this. I remember that when Metropolitan Loris of blessed memory passed away, I thought as well that a certain era of, spiritual men, the leaders of the church abroad, had come to an end, a very sad end. And in this sadness, in this grief and sorrow, in this lamentation of losing a spiritual guide, a spiritual person, there is hope, because Abba Isaac basically says, if you keep the Lord's commandments and the Holy Father's admonitions, you will be saved. So if we do that, even when our examples, when those who have inspired us to live a holy life are taken by God into his heavenly kingdom, we could continue in their steps as though they were still present, if we keep doing the things that they taught us, and sort of if we keep doing things the way that they taught us. And the last 12th chapter for Abba Isaac is, Abba Isaac said that Abba Pambo used to say, the monk's garment should be such that he could throw it out of his cell for 3 days and no one would take it. That's quite beautiful. Basically, he's saying that, your garment should be so old and so tattered, so, sort of useless, that if you throw it out for 3 days, nobody walking by would pick it up because they would consider it to be useless, just too old, in such a state of disrepair that, they couldn't really benefit from it. We will finish with that for today. God willing, we will continue next week. If you will allow me, I'll take a very quick glance at the schedule for September, and then I might be able to tell you when exactly we should have our reading. Next week, next week there is a vigil for the beheading of St. John the Baptist on Friday night. So most likely our next broadcast would be next Wednesday, and God willing, if there are no circumstances that would require my presence elsewhere at 7 p.m., we will do it in the evening to give everybody a chance to join us and view. But if both Wednesday and Friday night are going to be tied up, then I will, of course, move the broadcast to 3 p.m. So trying to keep to Wednesday and Friday, and trying to keep it to 3 p.m. or 7 p.m. so that you have somewhat of a steady schedule. I do apologize. My schedule is such that, to commit an entire, additional evening every Thursday night, I'm with the youth at the church for sort of the Russian theological youth group, and it would be really, really, really difficult schedule-wise, to sort of block one evening on a regular basis. So thank you so much for being patient and for bearing with me with us moving from Wednesday to Friday, and then from 7 to 3 p.m. from time to time. God bless all of you. Please keep me in your prayers. Stay safe, stay healthy, and God willing, we will continue. We're right now pretty much in the middle of the book. It is this wonderful book. I've actually found an image of this book that I'm using as a thumbnail on YouTube. So God willing, we will see you all next Wednesday. God bless.